Great. Okay, so why don't we get started now? I see we've got about 30 or so participants already joining, so I think it's a good start. Hopefully people will join as we move along. So let's get started. First, I want to welcome everyone. Thank you for joining our webinar. It's hopefully you get something out of it today. And my name is Kevin Riendo, and I am the founder and CEO of Anextere. And we're sponsoring this, presenting and sponsoring this with NWorld today. So again, welcome. And today's topic is people, processes, technology, crisis preparedness, and the new normal. So let's get started in discussing. First thing we'll do is we'll talk a bit about the rules of the game. So we're on the same page as we speak through, and then go through the agenda and everything. So first step is, so we've muted all of your, we've muted the devices, default, the cameras down. And when you have questions, please raise the questions through your Q&A session, log those, and also raise your hand. We will wait until the 15-minute Q&A session to discuss all of your questions for our panels. And Kevin Naylor from NWorld will be our manager of questions, and he will aggregate and come with the best questions, and he'll come to me with those, and we'll raise them to our panel going forward. Okay. This is our agenda. So we'll do a brief introductions, self-introductions of our panel members. We'll introduce our companies that are sponsoring briefly, and then we'll get into the panel discussion. Next, the panel discussion, we anticipate 35 minutes of discussion. And then we'll get into our Q&A, which is about 15 minutes. And then we'll do the final closing about 5 minutes or so. But that will leave us some room to do more questions and answers if we have those to discuss further. So that's the agenda. So let's get into the introduction. We'll start with the speakers first. So I'll start with Bob. So Bob, maybe you can give a brief introduction of yourself for the audience.
Thank you, Kevin. Hi, I'm Bob Nodden. I'm the chairperson of the American International Group, or AIG companies here in Japan. This is the second largest market in the world for AIG, and so what happens here matters. I've been in Japan 4 different times, once as a college exchange student back in 1982 in Osaka, and then 3 different times with AIG, both in 89 for 6 months, for 4 years, from 2002 to 2006, and then I returned to Japan in 2009 and have been here since then. So considerable amount of time on an accordion basis, if you collapse it together, here in Japan, but over several decades in that process. So it's good to be here today and happy to join. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob. Welcome. Next, Misa, would you please introduce yourself?
Thank you, Kevin. And hi, everybody. Today, my name is Misa Yamashita. I worked for several multinational companies as HR heads over the past 20 years. And now I'm acting as an independent HR advisory and consultant. I'm happy to share my experiences with my previous companies, including AXA, which it was my last company that I worked as HR head. So looking forward to today's discussion with all of you. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Misa. Thank you for that. And Vijay, last but not least.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Kevin. Thanks you, everyone, for joining. I'm looking forward to the discussion with Bob and Misa today. My name is Vijay. I'm the president for NWorld Japan. I'm originally from Canada. I've been in Japan almost 19 years now, and working in the recruitment industry since 2004. I actually started my career with NWorld back when it was called Wall Street Associates, and have worked for one other company in between my stints at NWorld, but I've been back with NWorld since 2017 as the president for the Japan business.
Great, thank you, Vijay. Next. So maybe Vijay, you can give a brief update of your introduction of your company.
Sure, thanks. I'll try to keep it relatively brief. Hopefully most of you know of or have heard of NWorld or have worked with us in some capacity. NWorld is the leading partner for global talent in Japan, and we operate across the region as well. We have operations in India, Thailand, and Vietnam. We're part of the Japan Group, which is our parent company. N-World focuses on recruitment services, and we've tried to provide basically a full spectrum of talent solutions for our clients and candidates in the market here. So that includes permanent hires, permanent recruitment on both a contingency basis and on executive or retained search projects. We also do contract staffing services as well as recruitment process outsourcing. So basically work with primarily global companies, both Gaishi and Japanese companies that have needs for global talent. And we try to work across all different functions, a variety of corporate sectors, and try to be able to support any of the staffing or talent needs that our clients might have. Our mission is to enable success. So our priority is to make both our clients and the people that we introduce to them more successful through their partnerships with us.
Great, thank you, Vijay. And further on, I will be, as I mentioned previously, I'll be the facilitator or moderator, and I'm the founder and CEO of Anextere. So Anextere is a company, well, actually, I've been in Japan about, I would say 17 years. I spent also 6 years in Hong Kong covering Asia Pac. I came over in 2000. I started, most of my career has been with financial services. So I came over with Goldman Sachs, and I've moved my way through. My last role was with, before founding the company, was with PGIM Investments in Japan as COO. And basically, based off all those experiences, that's why we decided to launch the new company and found Anextere. So I'll go briefly into what Anextere does a little bit. So it's pretty self-explanatory, and you guys can all look at this. But overall, Anextere is, we started Anextere with a vision of people, processes, and technology. We believe it's the lifeblood of all of the businesses, and it's an enabler of business success and sustainability. So we started with that foundation, and we kind of built off of that and went into, business and technology solutions. And our core force offerings are business process digitization, risk management solutions, management consultancy, which is more like C-suite execution and transformation. And then lastly, we have an AI-enabled machine translation service that we do. So, again, it fits into what we're going to discuss today. It is the basis of how we would want to run our company, and we look forward to listening to the panel today about people, process, and technology. Okay, so before we start out with the discussion, we'll do a brief kind of overview, kind of just set the topic to help people understand kind of where we're coming from today. So basically, we will discuss the human side of crisis leadership and the intersection of people, process, and technology, because we believe it's all related, and we all have to look at all of these three areas within our companies. We believe crisis events are litmus tests of overall operational preparedness, and companies should learn from these events and continuously invest in their people, processes, and technology to mitigate business risks and ultimately improve long-term business results. Thus, our panel of senior business leaders will discuss how their businesses were impacted by this crisis, what immediate steps they took to ensure business continuity, and what the future looks like in terms of people, processes, technology, and business sustainability. So those are the main topics, and we'll go into each one of those. And we'll start with, so we're going to start with Bob first, and Bob's going to talk a bit about the process piece. So Bob, talk about like what you do with processes, how it's related to other parts of your business, and hit on those three areas that we outlined. So Bob, go ahead, please.
Thanks, Kevin. I would start by saying, first of all, as an insurance company, when crisis happens, it has a twofold implication. First of all, it means my customers are in crisis, whether it's an individual event, like a building fire or power outage, or maybe denial of service from a cyber standpoint, et cetera. Or it could be something more material and potentially even systemic, like 2011 after the earthquake, the tsunami, and the radiation fears, et cetera. So what that means is that when when people tend to run away from a problem, as an insurance company, you have to run to it, because our job is to be there for our customers in that process, right? And so consequently, when we think about business continuity, and this is really all about, risk management and how people respond in those pivotal moments. Our challenge is that we need to be agile and ready to be there for our customers. So our thinking around how we deal with business continuity really is no different in the COVID situation than it is with an earthquake or a building fire. We need to be there when our customers need us. There's new challenges as a result of this, right? And when we talk about processes, this is, as all of you know, an environment where paper still has a significant role to play in most things that go on in the business community. There's a desire on most people's parts to see a red seal, a honko, to signify, agreement and contractual obligations. There's still challenges where people, in a traditional context, I've heard multiple folks complain about how their customers were adamant that the suppliers show up and meet them face to face, et cetera, in spite of the risks that were associated with it, et cetera. So as we thought about process, we had to be reflective of that, not only in how we responded to our customers and to our intermediaries, but at the same time, how was that process going to impede, or how were the changes going to impede our ability to do our job? So, what matters most with people as an insurance company is how quickly you respond to the disaster from a claim standpoint. And so that meant that for us, we had to be, incredibly mindful of concentration. So there were heavy rains in Kyushu in the early part of the spring, or late part of the spring. There was a typhoon a little later on in the year, which means there's a concentration of exposure. There's a lot of people who have suffered damages, et cetera. And getting people there to be able to work with them and respond to them caused us to have to think a little bit differently about how we went about those tasks. So we tried to make some adaptations to how we received, what we call a first notice of loss. We tried to make changes to how we would focus on responding with certain technical advice to be able to support people in that process. We had to move our customer service representatives to working from home, which had its own technology challenges, which we'll talk a little bit about later on in the context. And then there was the people side of process, which was, some folks prior to this worked in a very, independent kind of environment. They were capable of working on their own without a lot of direction, et cetera. And many weren't. They were in an environment where their task was maybe part of a broader process. And so they interacted with people before them when they did their piece of work. They interacted with people after them when they finished theirs and handed it off. So there's a lot of considerations that have to go into actually sitting down and saying, all right, if we're going to rethink this, how do we do that? In our case, really wasn't dramatically different than things that we've had to do in other big disasters, whether it was a building fire, whether it's an earthquake, whether there's typhoon that's locked everybody down until the storm and the wind blows past, et cetera, or power interruptions, et cetera. So I think the real test here and the fundamental difference has been duration, right? When those things happen, you may have an inconvenience for a couple of days or maybe a week or 2 weeks. In 2011, it was more like 5 weeks, 6 weeks that we were still struggling and wrestling with things. In this case, we go wave 1, wave 2, wave 3, and people are still sort of wondering, when is this going to change, or when is it going to get back to the way we were? And so the process component to this is key, but it can't be decoupled from how people interact with it, what their roles and responsibilities are, and how technology provides the support to moving procedural issues in a different fashion, keeping control over things, ensuring that, because people were working from home, they didn't have cyber risks, and they had documentation, and they weren't necessarily going to inadvertently leave it on a train or get it exposed to other people. So it really, not different, just the duration has been a lot longer. And so when we think about disaster recovery and business continuity, the same things have applied as a result of this, but we have to think about a more sustainable long-term implication to that. So I'll pause and sort of see if either Misa or VJ want to jump in and throw any more into that. But that would be how I would kickstart it relative to the thought process.
Great, thanks, Bob. I would also mention, I think the risk management's a key point, and I think that's something that integrating that into your business decision making is huge. So when you're looking at your businesses and thinking about the future and everything, the risk management part is very important part of the decision making process. So that's a very good point to raise.
And it is, Kevin. And I would say, you know, being a very large global insurance provider, the expertise and the skill of risk management is not terribly well developed in this market. And so, you know, you need to turn to people who can help you think that through. And then the discipline itself needs to be strengthened. And I know, you know, we try to help support that program. A number of our peers and our professional intermediaries are all invested in helping to expand the skill set and understanding and the importance of risk management.
Great, thank you. So Misa, do you have any thoughts to add and any comments in that part?
Sure, yeah, since I was HR head for my previous employer, which was AXA Life Japan, my role was particularly to really focus on our employees' health and safety. That was the big mandate that not only me, but the whole leadership team need to pay attention to. Of course, you know, customer was another piece, as Bob mentioned, and then of course we took care of it. But then let me just focus on what we did for our employees. As I said, the health and the safety of our employees was our first priority at the time. I was with AXA Life until March, so I didn't really go through the whole process. And then until today, things may have changed, but then at least when I was there, things already started. You know, as a global company, we started to take HR measures, including work from home policies and all that. Of course, even before Japanese government started to talk about work from home. So I think that was one of the biggest measures that we took to really make sure that our employees are safe to begin with. However, it was a lot of challenges actually for the headquarter people who were more used to working from home under the normal situation. Was easier to make it happen because we had that policy already in place for the past several years. So people were used to doing that, especially in functions like HR or finance or those more enabling function people. However, we wanted to make it happen for the other functions, including customer service people. However, we didn't really, as a company, we didn't really have enough PCs to allow our employees in customer services to work from home, or our IT infrastructure and IT security system was not strong enough to let it happen. So our IT team worked very hard to really strengthen that infrastructure first, and then also to try to encourage the people to feel much more comfortable working from home, especially in a customer service function, where actually we had a lot of paper processes, including fax, and then, you know, approval process was still like Hanko, as Bob mentioned. So it needed a lot of changes in terms of not only their mindset of the people, but also the processes as well. So that was a huge effort that we needed to do, but fortunately, I think we were able to make it happen to a pretty good level, even before emergency situation started in April in Japan. So that was the big one. Work from home, we have been talking about it for many, many years, but then not many people were participating in it. But then now, at the time, people were forced to do it. And we found that as a company, we didn't really have a strong enough, good enough infrastructure to support it. So we need to really work on it very, very hard to make it happen. Alongside with it, I think we also put a lot of other HR guidelines, especially for the line managers, so that they can make their own decisions on the ground, so to speak, for their employees, because, you know, we now work remotely, your managers are not next to you all the time. So managers, even employees in some cases, needed to their own decisions to make things happen. And again, our managers were not well equipped to make it happen in terms of their capability or tools as well. So we put the HR guidelines and the policies in place to really help our managers to make it happen. Of course, line managers, some of them feel very hesitant to make decisions, even to allow their employees to work from home. So of course, HRBPs came in to help their decisions to happen and all that. So whole HR team was also in the field to really support our line managers as well. I think those are the main measures that we took, and I'm sure that they are still in place so that things need to continue this way. To Bob's point, it's a long duration. It's not gonna stop in another 3 months or so. So how to make sure that these policies are in place and then people's mindset and the capabilities are ready is very key. And then I'm very proud to say that we took those measures at the very beginning of this whole situation so that people can learn along the way.
Great. You brought up some very good points, and we can touch a bit about this. I think why don't we'll stick to what we're doing now, and then we'll think about the future in our next part of this discussion. So something you talked about, sort of the productivity and how productivity, people productivity is really enabled by technology and enabled by processes. And all those things are really a big part of helping people survive and do well and be productive in their jobs. You also kind of mentioned a bit about the middle manager or the line manager level, which I think I've heard there's been a lot of talk about line manager, middle manager being very important parts of the organization for decision making and for escalation and for those parts. And it's very important to have them working well together and obviously the capabilities to do that. So I think you hit some very good points and things that have been challenging for many companies in the market. So that's great. Thank you. Vijay, what do you think on the technology side in relationship to these discussions and kind of as an enabler of productivity and staff satisfaction?
Yeah, I think the technology challenges that presented themselves because of the pandemic, there's been a number of different dimensions to it, and I think Bob and Misa have touched on some of these things, and there's also been kind of an evolution of how companies are meeting these challenges or trying to meet them. With N-World at the beginning of 2020, right when the first lockdown happened, fortunately we had already been moving towards enabling our people to work remotely, so distributing laptops, mobile devices, so people could work from home. But we really had to accelerate it. We were lucky that we'd already launched Microsoft Teams, so we could go to kind of virtual meetings quite quickly. But it was really the first phase of that was survival mode. How can we get people the kind of most basic tools at their disposal so they can do their jobs? And then we found different challenges that came out of that in the early stages. Some people, for example, didn't have good Wi-Fi environments at home. So when you're used to working in an office environment and you don't have to worry about that, that suddenly becomes a new problem. And how do you solve it? So we had to, for example, distribute some pocket Wi-Fis and things like that. So I think that first phase a lot of companies went through was just, can you get people to do their jobs at a basic level at home or remotely? And a lot of companies, fortunately, were able to get there. Not every company was, I think. So there's still a lot of challenges around that. But I think as it moved on, and Bob touched on the duration, has also been a big challenge because if you're working in a small apartment, and you live by yourself and maybe you're sitting on your floor, you can do that for, a couple of days or a couple of weeks even. But after, month on month that continues, it can become quite difficult. So, a new challenge that had presented itself was, what are people's working environments like at home, and what kind of, hardware, not even just, IT, but, what kind of chair do they have at home becomes another consideration. So companies starting to think about, how they can equip their people at home, or do budgets need to be allocated for that, is another consideration that then, becomes at the forefront. So that's another dimension of it. And I think, as we move forward and as we're seeing now, there's other elements as well. Security will become a really big issue because, do you have secured networks at home that people can and companies can be confident or are meeting the regulations or the security requirements that they have? I mean, Enworld's a recruitment company, so we do have some regulations, and we deal with personal information and privacy. So security is important for us. We need to make sure that our systems are not going to be violated or hacked by outside parties. But I think, for example, Bob and Misa will be more knowledgeable than I am on this, but, very heavily regulated industries like financial services, this is going to become even, far more important because, the types of security requirements that they have and how to meet those, working in a remote environment are become even more challenging. So yeah, it's a very multi-dimensional, problem to solve with technology. And I think as this pandemic and these lockdown situations continue, we're seeing this different evolution of different phases of problems that you have to solve from the technology aspect. But then it does tie into the processes and the people as well, because you have things like Misa mentioned, like hankos that are traditional in Japan. That process, if you're trying to automate that with things like DocuSign that aren't already in place, launching those and implementing those when you've already got people locked down or working from home become even more challenging. So yeah, it's been a very difficult but interesting 12 months to see how different companies have dealt with these different problems and how the problems themselves have evolved.
Great, BJ. That's great. So let's just go into our second phase of discussion here. So what I'm hearing, and I think I've heard in the past, is that there's a difference between BAU, so business as usual, just doing the daily work, getting that up and running again. That was number one priority, which took months, maybe in some cases, if not more. And then there's the project-based stuff and the strategy-based stuff, which may be a little bit more complicated and more difficult from remote work and doing it together that way. So there's some of those trends that we see, or staffing capabilities too. So you start to realize what staffing capabilities you have in your companies and things like that. So maybe we could just talk a bit about, I'll go back to Bob again and talk more on those parts in the future and sort of what you think where we're headed and what we have to do to prepare for that.
Sure. I think, again, I would start by saying that, you sit in Japan, you have a lot of exposure, right? The world has exposure to this pandemic, but in Japan, we're exposed to typhoons, we're exposed to earthquakes. Depending upon where you are, you might have some volcano exposure as well, which is sort of the natural stuff. But then there's the man-made elements of this, building fires, political unrest. God help you if you were in Washington, D.C., a week and a half ago trying to deal with things. So I think as we think about the intersection of, where we are and where we need to go, I think it's important to try to take a more holistic approach to understanding where do your people feel that they're equipped and where do your people feel they aren't equipped. How do they feel they have the ability to understand and influence their outcome, the task that they're supposed to provide in this process? And then how is the process and the technology allowing them to do it, right? So the idea of collaboration and communication is just, so fundamental when you can't actually sit around a table with each other. And if you're like most of us, you're probably a bit WebExed out at this stage in the game, in this process. So thanks you for joining today, but I'm sure that plenty of you are sort of sick and tired of sitting in a chair staring at a screen over and over again. And so this is hopefully, an unfortunate, but nonetheless a wake-up call that says this is the type of stuff that can happen in a grand scale like this or on a much smaller scale. Over the course of my career, I've been in places like the Philippines with typhoons and earthquakes, Guam with a major typhoon. I've had a number of different challenges around getting the job done in any one particular situation. And so you got to take this business continuity element of it seriously, right? And it needs to have the right visibility at the executive level. to be able to know that you can respond. Nothing's ever going to be perfect. And certainly, you know, that many of you've heard, you know, perfect is the enemy of good, right? And under circumstances, do you expect it to be perfect? I know in Japan, people don't like things that aren't perfect. Customer service expectations are incredibly high, et cetera. So to think about how to incorporate this into a more routine work environment is, I think, one of the takeaways we all have to wrestle with. So will the office look differently as we go forward? Will people coming into the office every day, like they have in the past, you know, continue? Or will there be staggered visits? Or will some jobs now become more routine to be worked in a remote environment versus in a physical environment in the office? I think the challenge that has to play out is some stuff that Vijay mentioned, as well as Misa, is that in some cases, you know, I know a lot of Japanese financial services organizations, you're not permitted to access the corporate systems from outside of the office, right? So there's obstacles in terms of company practices and policies around process and what we're allowed to do. And then there's the technical challenge that Vijay mentioned, that sometimes, you know, the younger generation's got a great phone and a great data plan, and so they don't think they need a Wi-Fi, right? You know, and so when you go through these exercises, better understanding onboarding of resources, looking at how skilled your staff is in being able to respond to a different work environment. You know, when you're think about a Japanese process, as I mentioned at the beginning, there's a lot of paper involved still in most businesses, right? And somebody needs to receive it. So who is that person? Are they doing that in the office, or is there other ways to do it, right? I learned through this process that Japan Post actually has a process that allows you to digitize something and have it physically delivered via Japan Post, right? So there's lots of different ways that you can think through how to alter the way things get done, but it starts with an expectation that your people can respond to it, and that the tools they have that they're working with, A, they understand, and B, they know how to use it in a different context. At the end of the day, if a task that someone's doing is very directed, meaning there's somebody sitting over the top of them and in the morning giving them a pile of things to do and saying, I need this done by 12, and then picking it up and handing them another pile, that's going to become an increasing challenge in an environment where suddenly it's not, please do this for the next week, but do it for the next 6 months, right? So that duration issue becomes a factor too. And I think as we think about those processes, there's certainly been a lot of reaction in the public domain around saying, well, why do I have to go back to all that paper that we used to have? What can we do differently as we go forward? Clearly, as Kevin mentioned, the financial services industry is a very heavily regulated industry here in Japan. And yet the regulator has been incredibly positive and responsive to saying, how do we adapt these processes going forward to eliminate some of these things that just choke because they're dependent on physical documents and physical movement of things from place to place, as opposed to virtual or digital. I heard a speech recently where people talked about, you know, technology connects devices. Digital connects people to people, right? And so when we think about how to look to the future and to learn from this process, it's about how can we connect people to people as they go through these processes? What tasks really are adding value and what aren't? And therefore, how can we concentrate on those pieces of activity and critical decision points that can be better informed with technology and with communications, right? There's training that goes along with all of this that we kind of maybe assume people understand, right?
Thank you very much. I appreciate. So let's just get on. So let's hear a little bit from Misa about on the people side of that, and maybe you can add to what Bob brought up. Some great points there.
Sure. Yeah, and then you Kevin also mentioned about the BAU, business as usual, and I think you know, based on my experience, not only with AXA but also with other companies that I worked for previously, I really feel what we are doing today for our employees are something that we need to do even under the BAU situation. Maybe work from home 100%. is not necessary. It's not necessary. However, I think how to empower our line managers and our employees, to Bob's point, to give them tools and capability to make things happen is going to be even more important, even under the BAU situation, I think. If you look at the leadership style that is needed, I think maybe over the past 20 years, I would say that changed quite a bit. Maybe in the past, people were waiting waiting for some other people, your managers, to make decisions so that you can do something. Under today's environment, I think you need to be much more empowered to make your own decisions so that you can make faster decisions closer to the customers and respond to any crisis situation, be it earthquake or flood or pandemic. So I would say what we are talking today is not only for the crisis situation, but also maybe more ongoing capabilities and then process and tools that we need to have moving forward. That's how I feel. So especially I want to really mention about, again, the line managers' capability, because they are key in make things happen operationally, and also to from a viewpoint of taking care of our employees. So I think those will continue, I'm sure.
Great. Thanks, Misa. So some of the key things we've been hearing is sustainability, I think, is a key theme. Business results. How do you have sustainability and business results together, combined? I think that's a key thing, because a lot of people think that if you invest into sustainability, your costs may go up and your profitability may go down, and but the case is maybe that's not the case, and probably that is not the case. If you invest correctly and wisely, you should improve your profitability long term, at the same time have sustainability, which is the key to everything, I think. So that's great thoughts on that. So Vijay, maybe from your perspective, if you could kick in some thoughts about on the capability side, the staffing, on the how do you find the right people, to Misa's points and Bob's points.
Yeah, I think one of the first things I guess to mention is this pandemic it's been kind of unique, I think, because not everybody's been affected by a flood or a fire or something like that. But I think the COVID pandemic has been so widespread, the scope has been so widespread that everybody now understands that any business is susceptible to disruption by some kind of external, unpredictable influence, right? So I think that not only business leaders, but staff at all levels now understand that, and that's something that companies need to be prepared for. So I think from the perspective of attracting talent, engaging talent, retaining talent, companies also need to understand that the people looking to work for them and the people working for them will be thinking about, how prepared is this company for the next disruption that happens, which will happen at some point in the future. And do they have a good remote working policy? Do they have technology that's going to allow me to continue to do my job? Do we have processes in place and managers in place who understand how to manage people in different situations that not necessarily mean sitting right next to that person on the desk? So those are things that, people looking for jobs now, and people, thinking about changing jobs or thinking about whether they should stay in a company or not. Those are, questions that are going through their minds, and it's going to be more and more important for companies to make sure that they're proactive about, being able to answer those questions and, being able to create environments that are attractive for, the most talented people they want to have working for them, or they'll be left behind. And this is not just my opinion. I think this is coming from actual, feedback that we get from surveys we do with job seekers and with employers. And this is, I think, a really big shift that in my career in recruitment we haven't seen before, because as I mentioned, and as Bob and Misa have touched on, there have been business disruptions in the past, but they have not been the same kind of duration, or they've not necessarily been as widespread. But this I think has really made it more universal, that everybody's more aware, acutely aware, that this kind of business continuity with respect to how people are managed, how processes are are managed and how technology is implemented are going to affect these things. So yeah, I think it's quite a new environment that we're going to be moving towards, whether the vaccines put COVID to bed or not. It's still something that people will be thinking about.
Great, BJ. That's good. And a couple of things on there. I think, we'll get back. So for all of the attendees, we have got about a few more minutes left of discussion, which we'll talk more and we'll continue. But if you have any questions or anything, please raise your hand and start to put them in the Q&A box so we can prioritize those. So appreciate that. So but going back to the point, I think, I coming from a financial institutions background, banking, I think there's been a lot of work around risk management, BCP, the mortgage crisis. There's been all kinds of Lehman shock. So there's been all kinds of different types of crises that have hit throughout that have impacted the financial industry. And they put a lot of regulatory controls in place and BCP and everything. But I think, this one is kind of magnified that not just financial institutions, but this goes for in all industries now. So all industries are involved. So this risk management mindset, in many cases, is like, oh, that's only financial world or whatever. But I think that's changing, and that has to change. So going back to Bob's original kind of thoughts on risk management, maybe you could talk a bit more about that. But I think that's a key thing that people have to understand and make in part of their strategy. Their business strategy has to include a risk management part of that. So Bob, go ahead. Just any thoughts on that and how you?
Yeah, I think I would first of all heartily endorse that the general view. And why do I say it? I mean, when you're an insurance company, there's certain things you can protect against, right? But you can't protect against everything. And here's a classic example, right? So the understanding of what types of things can have the most significant impact on your ability of your business to continue to operate is what drives a risk management conversation. What are the things that are going to be the most significant in impacting our ability to open the doors in the morning, to produce a product, to supply things to vendors and other partners is key. And that then drives what can you financially protect against, and what do you operationally have to protect against, right? So you can't insure everything, right? So what things should you put in place to ensure that you can have your people working remotely? What things do you need to ensure to ensure that you've got adequate security, cyber security in place in an ever increasing world of risk and exposure? What types of things do you have to do to ensure that people who supply things to you are not, any interruption on their side of things is going to have any downstream impact on the business that you do? So it starts with an appreciation to, what are the most significant things that can impact your ability to perform your task or your business's function. And then understanding what is something that can be financially protected against versus what needs to be operationally protected against. And then how do you prioritize, putting resource and energy into both, thinking it through, but then testing it, right? Because what you don't want to do is go into a test mode when the disasters hit. Right. And an awful lot of people, I'm sure, when they realize they got to start moving people to home, like Misa said, they're not ready to, right? Because they haven't actually gone through that exercise to test it out. So.
Great. Thanks, Bob. It's perfect timing. So we're heading into the Q&A session. So I think we've got a few questions already, which I think Kevin Naylor will bring, and we can continue our discussions. Please, Kevin.
Yes, hello everybody, panelists, thanks to all of our attendees. So I'm going to be moderating the Q&A. My name's Kevin Naylor, I'm from EndWorld. So I've already got a couple of questions queued up. As Kevin Riondo has mentioned, please put your questions in the Q&A, or if you would like to ask them live, you can put your hand up and I will allow you to talk as well. So I guess right now I don't have any hands up, so I'll go to the first question I have. And Ian Y. So Dave has asked, can you give some concrete examples of tools or processes that a company can implement to build in BAU and disaster resiliency? So Kevin, I'll let you farm that out to the panel.
Great, thanks for that. Well, I guess that's a bit of a technology and process question. maybe Bob again, do you have any thoughts on that first?
Sure. So I'm not pitching a brand, but what happened with us starting in 2018 with the horrible typhoons down in Osaka was we needed to find a way to get what we would call first notice of loss, or the documents that a customer needs to submit when they want to advise they have a claim. And so we introduced a DocuSign. So we took that process and moved it to a digitized one, where the customer can take photos of the documents or scan the documents, whether it's on their cell phone or they've got a scanner they can get access to, and the process becomes one that's digitized. So it's not a paper process moving from person to person. It's secured. The parties are authenticated, et cetera. And so we had that in place already. And when we had to switch to the next stage here, we just put that on steroids to push more and more of the work that we were doing into a digitized process that eliminated the paper and therefore the handoff exercises and the physical limitations that came with it.
Do you think people became more open to the changes then at the time than they were previously?
Absolutely. It's a great question. They had no choice, right? If you wanted to get things done, then that was a way that you could get it done promptly and feed it into the process. So there was a much more dramatic recognition that they could move forward in that environment, that it was secure, that their process could be easier tracked and identified because it had logical checkpoints and steps along the way that had been incorporated into it, and the adoption rate was much higher.
Great. Any other thoughts from the panel?
I mean, I can throw in my 2 cents. I do think, and again, not to pitch a product, I do think Microsoft Teams is what we use, and it's been really effective. Not only because it has kind of video conferencing functionality, but it has a number of other functionalities as well. We're using Zoom today. Zoom's really good as well. But I think the point that I would try to make is that you have to be proactive about trying to get the most out of those tools. So with us using Microsoft Teams, like I said, it's not just a video conferencing tool. So there's a lot of different other functionalities that, I wasn't aware of at all when we first launched it. And now we're able to use, I think, to great effect, to communicate with people in different ways that we've never communicated before. And even if we get back to a large percentage of people working in the office, I think we'll still leverage, some of the ways that we can communicate through Teams, in the post-COVID world. And it will enhance our ability to communicate across the business in general. So how you use that technology and how you're proactive about it is really important as well.
I'll throw one in. The company I was at previously had like multiple chat rooms and things that they were using, and it's a financial firm, so it's actually quite sensitive to the access and things like that. But Symphony was one. There was all these other chat rooms which were used that could help get trading done and things like that, which are very secured methods to do that. But it was funny, they had like multiple ones, and I think they have to streamline it into one or two, which actually people use, instead of having 5 different ones, which is actually a big risk because you have multiple channels and multiple chat rooms and that's something you have to pay attention to. You have to try to streamline those too at the same time. Kevin, is there any other questions you could raise?
Yes, actually, we have quite a few questions online. So I'm going to throw a big one out here for those of you who are future readers. How do you think the new normal will look? Are you currently planning to further implement telework after the crisis? And how will this affect property planning? Are you planning to reduce workspace and make telework an essential strategy for your firm?
Great. So I guess why don't we start with Bob and VJ for working, and then we'll go to Misa to briefly come in on that. So
yeah, so we talked a little bit with the panel before we started today. There's plenty of people who think that work from home is the best thing that ever happened. Their quality of life's gone up. They're ecstatic. They're not commuting an hour and a half each way into the office type of stuff. And yet there's other folks who are incredibly stressed out, because I saw another question in there about stress, right? Where either they're not around their family or their family's all around them, right? Kind of thing. And so the environments it can play a big factor in that process. So we've been able to clearly identify that a number of functions are working pretty well from home and don't need the same sort of physical context around an office environment that we've had in the past. I think we'll all be forced to think through property elements of our environments differently, because you'll want to be more touchless, so people aren't touching doors to get open, et cetera. You'll want to be thinking about circulation and how people move around the offices. But certainly, I think we'll see a number of organizations rethink exactly how big the office should be and how many people should be there on a 9 to 5 basis, or more Japan sort of 8 to 10 basis, as we think about the future.
VJ, do you have any quickly to add to that?
Yeah, I think, the pendulum has swung so far to an extreme of remote working that probably nobody really expected to happen. Even Enworld, we were moving towards a remote working policy, but never expected that it would be, 90% of our people working from home most of the time. I think the pendulum will swing back to a certain degree. Bob said, depending on your job, your function, your environment at home, your commute, there'll be a lot of considerations that people put into, whether they're working in the office or how often they're working in the office. But I do think we'll see, things, swing back to a certain degree. On the commercial side, I think one thing that's really important to keep in mind, once people get to the point where they're not worried about their health and safety and vaccines are distributed, I do think, at least in our business, for example, it's a very people-oriented business. As soon as we start seeing, business being won because somebody had lunch with a customer or went to a customer's office, then you're going to see that happening across the board, and that will become the norm again. So I do see that kind of customer interaction, face-to-face customer interaction, at least in our types of business or service types of businesses where you need to interact with customers in person, that coming back, once vaccines are distributed and the health risks subside.
Great, thanks. And Misa, do you have any brief comment just from a general thoughts on?
Sure, I think both Bob and Vijay touched on it, but then in my mind as well, I think what I would call work style flexibility will continue. So people now may be able to choose to work in the office or work from home or work from any other offices if they want to, if all the infrastructure and IT system is in place. And then people are empowered to make those decisions. So I think that will continue, I would say. Also, in order to make that happen, I also saw some questions around the stress. So if you are working from home or anywhere alone, I'm sure stress will increase. So how the managers can take care of their employees will be very, very important. I think the required style of management or leadership style will change, or is changing already by now. I think managers are required to have more EQ, so to speak, on top of IQ, so that they can take care of people and their mindset.
Great, thanks, Misa. Kevin, any further questions?
Yeah, we've got plenty of questions, but not necessarily plenty of time. So I'm going to mash a couple of questions together that'll kind of come along this line of questioning. So, and it's around, so Gautam's question is kind of considering work and life in Japan. How did people cope with the work from home environment? And how are companies now thinking about categorizing people who can work from home on a long-term basis? And that may have an infrastructure cost benefit to the company. This kind of goes back to Michael's question around reconsidering your workspace. And then, so introducing remote work in kind of a production function or within a team concept, it maybe creates some abstraction to the individual's ability to perform their job, and then making a decision whether they can or should work from home. And then does this move into a right or a responsibility for that person to choose to work from home, or whether they must come into the office based on their kind of productivity? Does that become kind of a right as opposed to a preference? So I think this is kind of who's able to work from home, how does that benefit the company from a cost perspective, and then how do you make that decision on a productivity, and whose decision is it, the person or the company?
Great. So let's start with just Bob again, and we can go through the three panelists.
Well, I think they're both really excellent questions, and not to sound like a cop-out, but I think in some cases it's a function of the industry. What are you doing? So the construction industry, if you've gotten out and walked around and noticed they didn't stop. They're still cranking things out, right? They're wearing masks and they're doing their thing, but they didn't stop putting buildings up and taking houses down and doing construction work, et cetera. So I think a challenge there is around, as leaders, you need to ask yourself, is this a task that requires somebody to be in the office? Either because there's something hugely secure about the environment they need to work in, or no, it's actually, it could be done from home. And then it becomes a case of, are they more productive working from the office or working from home? And that's a function that, Misa's talked about before in terms of, well, how do you gauge that? And how do you empower middle management to be able to operate in that kind of environment? So the question about teamwork, I think, directly connects to that. And Japan has a history of being very hierarchical and structured in its environment, where decision making doesn't necessarily cascade down. And I think as organizations, we need to tackle that if we're going to be able to allow people to actually work more flexibly in this environment going forward.
Great, thanks. And Vijay?
Yeah, I think it is an excellent question. I think it's a difficult question to answer. I do think, I would essentially agree with Bob. It does really depend on what your job is. It depends on what your industry is. But I do think, when it comes to the question of productivity, ultimately, work needs to get done. Business is a competitive environment. And I think, there's not going to be a tolerance, both internally within organizations or, from a competitive perspective, to not get the job done, right? So if that job requires meeting a customer in person, if it requires being on a construction site, then that's what's going to continue to happen. But I think there will be, as much as possible, a push for flexibility where, if that's not required and you can do the job as at same or better productivity levels from home or from your Starbucks or wherever you're going to work, then that will be acceptable too. But I think the competitive landscape and the requirement of getting the job done is not going to go away.
Great, Vijay. And Misa, any final comments?
No, I think I totally agree with what the two gentlemen said. At the end of the day, we work for a company to deliver the results, right? So in order to make that happen, what will be the best setup in terms of where to work from home and what kind of employee and their capabilities we need to have. So work from home now is a choice, not a mandate or the 100% new norm.
Great. Well, this has been wonderful. I think we have to be closing up soon. So again, those are great questions. And if there's any other questions, always you can raise it to us separately on that, and we will come back to you on that. So let's just first, I want to thank all the panel members for participating. It's great to have all of you here, and I think it was a great mixture of different thoughts and different views. And it all is collectively very important for us to understand. So that was wonderful. And thank you. And I hope that all the attendees got very good, insightful, and actionable information. That the key and the goal of this was to give people thought to think about and what they can do and help them get through the situations and be actionable going forward. My last comments are sort of, on top of everything, I think this really shows the importance of a partnership between business, HR, and people, and technology and processes. So it's very important to get everybody on the same page in your organizations to work together on all these topics and to find solutions that really combine everything together, because there's really no one answer for one thing. You can't do technology and processes without the people. And you can't do, technology, without how to handle it and how to implement the technology. So there's a lot of just thoughts have to be involved with how you're going to implement this, what you think about it, how you integrate it all. But I think this was a great start. And the good thing is this is the first of a series of webinars that we're doing between Anextere and EnWorld hosting. And we'll be doing future ones and get more in-depth knowledge and everything there. So we would invite all of you, and if you would like to come or like to participate in some way, please let us know, and we will set those up, and we will start to think about what the next topics will be with more detail to help you going forward in the future on that. So again, thank you all very much, It's very much appreciated, and have a great day.
Cheers.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Kevin, thanks everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.